Everyone knows the perfect ending to Casablanca, but almost no one knows about the scene that cost $8,000 to film, only to be scrubbed from history just 48 hours before the premiere. In 1942, that was a small fortune. So why did the studio pay for it, film it, and then bury it forever? The answer reveals a side of Rick Blaine the world was never supposed to see. We are talking about a movie that is universally celebrated as a flawless cinematic masterpiece. Every line of dialogue is legendary, every shadow is meticulously placed, and the ending is widely considered the most romantic, self-sacrificing moment in film history. But underneath this polished, heroic veneer lies a dark, discarded secret. The version of Casablanca we all know and love was built on a foundation of last-minute panic, heavy-handed censorship, and a desperate cut. Had this single, expensive scene remained in the final print, Rick Blaine would not be remembered as the tragic, noble anti-hero who gave up the love of his life for the greater good. Instead, he would have been cemented in the public consciousness as a cold-blooded, heartless war profiteer who looked a desperate man in the eye and chose money over a human life. To understand how close we came to losing the Casablanca we know today, we have to travel back to the smoke-filled, high-stakes world of Warner Brothers in 1942. In 1942, the United States was newly thrust into World War II. The entire country was mobilizing, and Hollywood was no exception. The federal government realized that movies were the most powerful tool of mass persuasion ever created. At the same time, the major studios were operating under strict economic constraints. Warner Brothers was notorious for its tight budgets, swift shooting schedules, and no-nonsense production ethics. Every single dollar had to be accounted for. $8,000 in 1942 was not just pocket change. It was equivalent to more than $150,000 today. In the context of a movie production that was already pushing its financial limits, spending that kind of money on a single sequence and then throwing it into the incinerator was an act of absolute desperation. The film itself was being shot in chronological order, which was incredibly rare and expensive, meaning the script was literally being written and revised while the cameras were rolling. The writers, Julius and Philip Epstein, along with Howard Koch, were constantly battling the clock, the studio bosses, and the looming shadow of the Hayes office, the industry's strict censorship board. The pressure was suffocating. The studio needed Casablanca to be a hit, but more importantly, they needed it to serve as a beacon of American moral superiority during a global crisis. They could not afford to put a foot wrong. Yet in their scramble to inject realism into this wartime drama, they filmed a scene so brutal and ethically compromised that it threatened to destroy the entire narrative arc of their main character. This brings us to the lost scene itself. Picture the dimly lit, smoke-hazed interior of Rick's Café Américain. In the theatrical cut of the movie, we see Rick Blaine as a detached cynic who claims he sticks his neck out for nobody. But his actions consistently betray his inner warmth. We see him rig the roulette wheel to help a young Bulgarian couple escape the corrupt clutches of Captain Renault. It is a beautiful, defining moment of compassion. But the deleted $8,000 scene painted a diametrically opposed picture of who Rick Blaine really was. But here is the shocking twist that almost no one knows. It was not the studio executives who ordered this scene to be destroyed, and it was not the strict censors of the Hayes office. The command to burn this $8,000 footage came from a much higher, much more secretive authority, the United States government itself. Specifically, the Office of War Information, a federal agency created to monitor and control American media during the war. They took one look at the rough cut of Casablanca and realized that if the American public, or worse, international allies, saw an American protagonist behaving like a ruthless, predatory war profiteer, it would destroy the carefully crafted image of American heroism. They gave Warner Brothers a terrifying ultimatum: cut the scene, or the movie will be banned from export entirely. This sudden, high-stakes intervention threw the entire production into absolute chaos just 48 hours before the premiere. In this lost footage, a desperate refugee, having fled the horrors of Nazi-occupied Europe, approaches Rick in his private office. The man is terrified, clutching his last remaining possessions of any value. He begs Rick for passage out of the city, pleading for his life as the secret police close in. In the original script, Rick does not show mercy. Humphrey Bogart plays Rick with a chilling, cold-eyed detachment. He looks at the desperate man, examines the jewelry with the practiced eye of a pawn shop owner, and flatly tells him that his life is not worth the price of the ticket. He demands a massive, impossible sum of money, essentially telling the refugee that if he cannot pay the premium, he can go back to the streets and face the firing squad. This scene was designed to establish Rick's absolute neutrality and his ruthless survival instinct. It was meant to show just how far he had fallen from his idealistic past, fighting in Spain. But when the footage was processed and assembled, the effect was devastating. 3 supporting examples show how this would have completely shattered the movie. First, it would make his later rescue of the Bulgarian couple look like a bizarre, inconsistent fluke rather than a revelation of his true character. Second, his coldness toward Bogart, who is arrested and killed earlier in the film, would feel vindictive and cruel rather than a tragic necessity of his neutral stance. And third, his final sacrifice at the airport, where he lets Ilsa go with Victor Laszlo, would lose all of its emotional weight because the audience would never believe that a man so brutally greedy could ever be capable of genuine, selfless love. To truly understand the impact of this cut, we have to look at it through a counterintuitive lens. What if keeping this brutal scene would have actually made Casablanca a superior, more honest work of art? Casablanca is often classified as a drama or a romance, but it is deeply rooted in the traditions of film noir. In classic noir, the universe is inherently corrupt, and there are no clean hands. Everyone is compromised, and survival requires a piece of your soul. By cutting this scene, the studio and the government sanitized Rick Blaine. They took a gritty, realistic depiction of wartime opportunism and polished it into a romantic fantasy of flawless American exceptionalism. A truly hard-boiled, realistic version of Casablanca would have forced the audience to confront an uncomfortable truth: that survival in a Vichy-controlled, fascist-adjacent territory required active moral rot. Rick Blaine could not have run the most successful nightclub in Casablanca, catering to both corrupt local police and Nazi officers, without being a predator himself. By removing this scene, Hollywood chose comfort over truth. This tension between Hollywood fantasy and grim reality is heightened when you look at the supporting cast. Most of the extras and minor characters in the film were not actors at all. They were actual European refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. When Yvonne, played by Madeleine Lebo, cries during the famous singing of La Marseillaise, those tears were not acting. She was a real-life refugee who had escaped Paris with her husband just ahead of the invading German army. The set of Casablanca was filled with people who had lived through the exact terror depicted on screen. To these refugees, the cold, profit-driven Rick Blaine of the deleted scene was not a fictional exaggeration. He was a very real type of predator they had likely encountered on their own desperate journeys. By deleting the scene, the filmmakers spared the audience from witnessing the darkest aspect of the refugee crisis, choosing instead to present a sterilized, redemptive myth. The scramble to remove this scene just 48 hours before the premiere was a logistical and technical nightmare. In 1942, editing a film was not a matter of clicking a button on a digital timeline. It was a physical, labor-intensive process involving actual celluloid film, sharp razor blades, and chemical cement. The master negative had to be physically cut, and every single positive print that had already been struck had to be tracked down and manually edited. Director Michael Curtiz, infamous for his tyrannical work ethic and explosive temper, coordinated with editor Owen Marks in a frantic race against the clock. They had to slice out the footage, splice the remaining celluloid together, and ensure that the audio track, which was printed optically directly onto the film strip, remained synchronized. If the splice was off by even a single frame, the sound of Sam's piano or the dialogue in the subsequent scene would drift out of sync, ruining the illusion of the film. Furthermore, the financial fallout of this cut created immense tension within the studio. Jack Warner, the famously tight-fisted head of Warner Brothers, was absolutely furious about throwing $8,000 directly into the trash. To put that in perspective, $8,000 could have paid the salaries of several supporting actors for the entire duration of the shoot. But producer Hal Wallis managed to convince Warner that the alternative was far worse. If the Office of War Information carried out its threat to block the film's export, Warner Brothers stood to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in international revenue. The physical negative of the scene was supposedly ordered to be burned, a common practice at the time to prevent unauthorized copies from leaking, leaving only a few production stills and script supervisor notes as proof of its existence. This desperate, last-minute surgical editing of Casablanca was not an isolated incident in Golden Age Hollywood. It was part of a broader, systemic pattern of studios aggressively re-engineering films to satisfy both moral censors and political agendas. A prime example is another Humphrey Bogart classic, The Big Sleep, released in 1946. After the film was fully completed and previewed for troops overseas, the studio realized they had a massive marketing asset in the real-life, sizzling chemistry between Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Warner Brothers ordered the director, Howard Hawks, to shoot entirely new, highly suggestive dialogue scenes, including the famous horse racing double entendre conversation, and cut out crucial expository scenes to make room for them. This left the plot of The Big Sleep famously incomprehensible, but it made the film a massive box office hit. Similarly, in Billy Wilder's 1944 masterpiece Double Indemnity, an incredibly expensive and highly detailed climax was filmed showing the main character, Walter Neff, being executed in the gas chamber. It was a grim, realistic depiction of state execution. But just weeks before release, the scene was cut and destroyed because the studio and the censors feared it was too graphic and would leave audiences feeling empty and depressed. Just like Casablanca, the studios realized that audience satisfaction and political compliance were far more valuable than artistic, uncompromising realism. In the end, the deletion of this $8,000 scene was a blessing in disguise. By hiding Rick Blaine's darkest instincts, the filmmakers accidentally created the perfect, timeless archetype of the reluctant hero. It allowed Rick to exist in a moral gray area just long enough to keep the audience guessing, before delivering one of the most satisfying emotional payoffs in cinematic history. If they had kept the scene, Casablanca would likely be remembered today as a cynical, forgotten relic of wartime propaganda, rather than the beloved masterpiece that continues to captivate audiences generations later. But the secrets of Casablanca do not end with this hidden scene. In fact, the legendary ending itself, including one of the most famous final lines in movie history, was completely fabricated weeks after the cameras stopped rolling, because the writers had absolutely no idea how to resolve the love triangle until the very last second. To discover the bizarre story of how they filmed multiple, secret alternate endings and the chaotic late-night recording session that saved the film from a disastrous climax, click on the video on your screen right now.